Hello and good afternoon, SciArc students, for a very special treat this afternoon. We are here to listen to and learn from the philosopher Graham Harman. His biography has been all over the school and all over the website, and so I'm sure that you can refer to that. But suffice to say, I truly believe Mr. Harman is one of the great thinkers of our era, if not for the 21st century, and it is my honor and privilege to welcome him here to SciArc today. Mr. Harman.
I'm always treated better by architects, artists, and social scientists than I am by philosophers. And I think the reason for that is that all of you, all those disciplines I just mentioned, are under a certain pressure to innovate. Philosophy is under pressure not to innovate. Philosophy is under pressure to think things through very carefully, very slowly. And there's been some hostility to the claims to innovation made by speculative realism and object-oriented ontology. Speaking of a slow-moving field, philosophy being a slow-moving field, let's start by talking about Immanuel Kant. I'm going to talk more about philosophy today than about architecture, just to make sure that everyone's got sufficient background about the work of me and my colleagues. I know some of you have been doing this in Dora's class. And on Monday, I'm going to get more into architecture directly and its connections with philosophy. Let me start by I'm going to put up a few pictures from the internet if I can. Hate to take down your nice new logo, but right, that's fine. I'll break my rule right away and put up a dead philosopher. Let's put up Immanuel Kant, just to ponder his greatness here. And, all right, this is as good as any. No, it's too small. I'm putting up Immanuel Kant, that's a younger Kant, very glamorous, before he discovered the principles of his so-called critical philosophy. Kant is a great piece of evidence as to how slowly philosophy moves, because Kant wrote his great book, The Critique of Pure Reason, published it in 1781, and that's now 234 years ago. And think of what's happened in your field in 234 years. You probably couldn't have a conversation with someone in your field from that time very easily. Kant, however, still is in many ways a contemporary philosopher. And I want to situate speculative realism and object-oriented ontology today with respect to the history of philosophy, but instead of starting at the beginning, I know Dora started with Parmenides in her class, so it started very far back. Let's start with Kant, and then we'll jump back a little later, and along the way explain what object-oriented philosophy is all about. Kant is considered a great turning point, the great turning point in philosophy since ancient Greece. What was so new about Kant? Well, Kant was the one, of course, who said that we cannot know the things in themselves, the things as they really are. Humans are finite. Humans experience everything in terms of space and time. We can't really know if there is a space and time outside of our minds. All we know is that all human experience takes place in space and time, as well as in 12 very basic categories of the understanding, such as unity, plurality, totality, cause and effect. We can't be sure if there's any cause and effect outside the mind. So he says that human beings are finite. Now, the funny thing is, everyone recognizes Kant as the great guiding spirit of all philosophy up till today, or at least most people do. But everyone is almost unanimous in rejecting his central idea, the idea of the thing in itself. Because what happened immediately after Kant? What was the next step in Western philosophy after Kant? Well, you have what's called German idealism. And their attitude towards Kant was generally this. It was that Kant was a great genius except for this stupid idea of the things in themselves. That's this naive idea he should have gotten rid of. Because what's the thing in itself? It's something you're thinking about, but it's outside thought. And yet when you say, I'm thinking of something outside thought, the German idealists say, but that's a thought, so you can't get out of the circle. And so there is no real separation between the phenomena that we can see and the noumena, the things in themselves that we cannot see. So they're saying that's a basic error that Kant makes. And most philosophies since that time have accepted this either tacitly or explicitly. You get this in Zizek today, and Badiou, and Meillassoux. You get it in different ways in phenomenology. I think Heidegger sort of sensed the way past it, but still very much. You're not going to find too many philosophers outside of my small circle of colleagues who are willing to defend the thing in itself. All right, so really where object-oriented philosophy comes from is 20th century phenomenology. So let's talk a little about that. And I'll put up another dead philosopher in spite of myself. I'll put up a very forgotten dead philosopher. That's Franz Brentano. Brentano was a former priest in Vienna, crazy looking guy, very intense person. That's very small. You get some sense. A very charismatic teacher, very demanding teacher. Was the teacher not only of Edmund Husserl, the founder of phenomenology, but also of Sigmund Freud, who was also very impressed by him. Brentano, his first major book in philosophy was called Psychology from an Empirical Standpoint. He brought back an idea known as intentionality. Intentionality was a medieval idea, actually from Islamic philosophy. Intentionality is the idea that every mental act has an object. He was trying to say, what is psychology as opposed to physics, or psychology as opposed to biology? Well, in physics, one thing smashes into another, but they don't perceive each other. They don't intend each other. They don't realize that that they're objects. He says human psychology is always about having an object. If you hate, you're hating something. If you love, you're loving something. If you're making a judgment, it's about something. If you're perceiving, it's something. All right, so this is why Brentano called his philosophy of psychology. He was trying to classify all the different mental acts in terms of what their objects were. And he's considered in this way the grandfather of phenomenology. There was a problem with his approach, though. He said that objects are immanent objects, which means they're objects in the mind. He's not talking about objects outside the mind. He believed in them. He came out of Aristotle. He had a very traditional education. Brentano believed that there was a real world, but he wasn't able to account for it in terms of his philosophy. It was never very clear what he thought the relationship was between the objects in our mind and the objects outside the mind. And this was the great problem he left to his students, an unusually gifted bunch of students that he had in Vienna. And one of the most important of these was a Polish student named Kazimierz Twardowski, who is a national hero in Poland because of all the things he did for their educational system. He's on postage stamps in Poland and so forth. And Twardowski said that Brentano needed to make a doubling. He needed to say that there is an object outside the mind and a content inside the mind. So there's a real chair outside the mind, but what's in my mind is a content, a specific number of qualities that I'm seeing. I'm seeing brown, I'm seeing rectangular, and so forth. Edmund Husserl, who was destined to become the most famous and most successful of these students of Brentano, struggled with these ideas of Twardowski for a number of years. Husserl was actually an older student because he had started in mathematics and then switched back to philosophy. And Twardowski was actually 7 years younger than he was, but more advanced philosophically. And Husserl had a hard time catching up with him. But when he finally did, he said, there cannot be a doubling. Why not? Because when I talk about Berlin, there can't be two Berlins. There can't be a Berlin in the real world and then a Berlin that I talk about, because otherwise you could never build a bridge between those. And so the city Berlin must also be accessible to me in my mind. Everything that exists is in principle accessible to my mind. And this is the beginning of phenomenology. But he did something very important that's usually overlooked. He didn't just deny the distinction that Twardowski made between an object outside the mind and a content inside the mind. Instead, he collapsed both of those distinctions into the phenomena. So now he kept a tension between objects and their qualities inside the mind. And that might sound like a dry point, but it's very important for a reason that I'll explain. Many philosophers, when they talked about objects in the mind, were deeply influenced by the movement called British empiricism. David Hume was a famous philosopher from that movement, along with John Locke. This was the late 1600s, early 1700s. And what somebody like Hume would say is that you don't really see objects. You see bundles of qualities. You see, you don't see an apple, you see red, round, juicy, cold. You feel and see these different qualities. And because these qualities come together so often, Hume said you bundle them together in your mind. But it's just a bundle of qualities. It's not an object. There's not something called apple over and above all the qualities. That's just a nickname for all those qualities put together. I would argue that the essential discovery of phenomenology, of Husserl's phenomenology, is that it realizes that British empiricism gets it backwards. You do not see red, sweet, juicy, hard, and then put them together in your mind through habits. What you see is an apple. What happens when you take an apple and rotate it in your hands? You don't say, okay, this is 97.3% similar to what I saw 1 second ago, and so I will therefore arbitrarily call this the same object. No, that gets it backwards. What you do is you say it's the same apple, I'm seeing different sides of it. And so Husserl was probably the first philosopher in history to say that there's an object different from its qualities, even within human experience. It's not just that there's some mythical object beyond experience that unifies all those things. It's that even within our experience, there's a tension between the apple and its qualities. This is going to be very important for object-oriented philosophy and for aesthetics and for a lot of other things. Another example he uses is his friend Hans. He says, I see my friend Hans walking down the street towards me. He seems sad today. He's wearing different clothes. He's in a different posture. Maybe he's had a haircut. You don't say, again, that this person is 94% similar to the person I used to call Hans, and therefore I'll call him Hans because he's close enough. No, you say it's Hans. Why is he in a worse mood today? He's wearing different clothes. Why did he decide to get a haircut? And so forth. So your direct contact is with the object, not with the qualities. Maurice Merleau-Ponty, another one of the most stylistically gifted phenomenologists, French philosopher who died too young, would say things like the black of an ink pen and the black of an executioner's hood are different blacks, even if they're the exact same wavelength of light. It's not the quality that shapes the object, it's the object that shapes its qualities. Obviously, the black of the executioner's hood is more ominous. It's tinted with all these other associations that it has. There is no set of given qualities that we then weave into objects. The objects come first. And that really can be said to be the central discovery of phenomenology. And that's Edmund Husserl, founded phenomenology in 1900-1901 in his great book, Logical Investigations. Now, his most famous pupil, who was destined to eclipse him, was Martin Heidegger, considered by many to be the great philosopher of the 20th century. I would concur with that, despite the many bad points of his biography, his Nazism, and some other things about his personal character. You can't deny the vast influence of Heidegger's philosophy. What did Heidegger find wrong with phenomenology? He was destined to take over the phenomenology movement. Husserl had chosen him to be the inheritor of this tradition. Well, Heidegger pointed out that Husserl thinks we should only describe things exactly as they appear to consciousness. Part of this was that Husserl was trying to resist the growth of the natural sciences in the late 1800s. It looked for a while like natural science was going to replace philosophy completely, that all philosophy was going to turn into experimental psychology, that it was just going to be a matter of doing experiments and seeing what happens in the mind when these experiments are done. And ultimately, these psychological theories were grounded in physical theories. So if you hear a door slam, you know the scientific theory is that sound waves go through the air, they go into your ear, they vibrate your eardrum, sends signals up your nervous system, and your brain processes it as a sound. No, that's a theory. As good a theory as it might be, as accurate as it might be, Husserl thinks we need to start from the description of the experience. We need to start from the, what does a slamming door sound like? What are all the different subtleties of that sound? These are the kinds of things he would have his students talk about. They would analyze a mailbox for one semester, for example. Sounds like a good architecture project, doesn't it? But yeah, how does the appearance of the mailbox change when you see it from different angles and different moods at different times of day? Phenomenology was trying to teach people that there were all these subtle different aspects of our perceptions of things. Okay, all very good. But Heidegger pointed out that for the most part, we are not encountering things as phenomena in our consciousness. That's a pretty rare experience. And I think this was one of the key moments of 20th century philosophy. It's a passage of Heidegger's Being in Time called the Tool Analysis, which actually goes back to 1919, 8 years earlier in his first university course. When he was just 29 years old, Heidegger gave an analysis of a system of tools. And what is it about tools? Not just hammers and drills, but anything that we're relying on in some way, is that they fade into the background. I wasn't conscious of this podium 5 seconds ago. I just thought of it now. Now I'm feeling what it's like against my shoes. It's a little bit rickety. It's probably safe enough to hold me up. But I wasn't thinking about any of that. You weren't thinking about the oxygen in the room. Unless you're having an asthma attack or unless it starts getting really stuffy, you're not going to think about it. And so for Heidegger, there's this universal interplay of things that withdraw, that become absent or recede into the shadows. And then normally, only when things malfunction do they become visible to us. And so there's this constant reversal in Heidegger. Things become invisible and then they become visible and so on. And usually if you're using a hammer, for example, he thinks you're not thinking about the hammer most of the time, you're thinking about the building that you're constructing. Only if the hammer shatters or if it starts to feel too heavy, do you then start thinking of the hammer per se. And so for Heidegger, there's this reversal. There is this background world that's something like a thing in itself. Edmund Husserl had said the idea of the thing in itself from Kant is absurd. Anything that exists must in principle be observable by a consciousness if it decides to look at it. Heidegger says no. Heidegger says even if you look at something, even if you stare at something straight away, there's going to be something of it that withdraws from access. And this is why history is important for Heidegger in a way that it's never important for Husserl. There's an old anecdote. Heidegger was Husserl's assistant. Husserl was supposed to give a lecture somewhere in Germany about the application of phenomenology to all the sciences, and he had biology, he had physics, he had geology, and Heidegger said, what about history? And Husserl said, good heavens, I forgot history. And that wasn't an accident. You can't really do as much with history in a phenomenological framework, because you're trying to talk about how things appear to you. Whereas for Heidegger, what's key to history is the fact that we don't master our own history. Our own history is there under us, we're acting on the basis of it. We can't cognitively master our own histories. We can never jump over our own shadows, as he says. Okay, so from here we can see what object-oriented philosophy wants to do. In a sense, you can think of it as a combination of these two traditions. What do Husserl and Heidegger have most in common? It's their concept of objects. Not many commentators say this, but I've made this case in a lot of publications. Husserl, I've already explained why he has objects, right? Husserl does not think the things we experience are bundles of qualities. He thinks there's something over and above that. They are objects. They are unified things that can have different qualities at different times. And you can see different qualities of an apple. You can taste different qualities of a beverage at different moments. So he's talking about objects that exist within experience. But there's a tension there, because you have an object, and the object always has different qualities attached to it. Heidegger is talking about a different kind of thing. He's talking about a hidden object in the background that we don't see, that also is in tension. And here I'm going to put up a diagram that anyone who's read the Quadruple Object might remember. The images here. Okay, I guess this is as good as any. Yeah, I hope it's large enough. What I first came up with about 8 or 9 years ago was the idea that there are two kinds of objects. There's the real object, the one that we can never access because it's always deeper than any consciousness of it. The sensual object is the one that exists in our perception. And that's the kind that Husserl talks about. And that's important to have because imaginary objects are also objects. There's a long tradition of saying this in Austrian philosophy. You can talk about dragons and centaurs and cartoon characters and so forth. They're still objects, even if they have no existence once all humans are exterminated or once you go to sleep. And there's two kinds of qualities. A thing has sensual qualities, so an apple has the various qualities that you can notice of it, the redness and the hardness and the coldness, but also the real objects. There are real qualities that a thing has that distinguish it from other things. I have Leibniz's name there because Leibniz, the German philosopher of the early 1700s, said that all things are one, and yet they're not just one, because if everything were merely one, everything would be the same, everything would be interchangeable. And so though each thing is one, each thing has a multitude of properties that distinguishes it, and these are real properties. What these lines are the tensions that for object-oriented philosophy, the world is made up of tensions between objects and their qualities. And since there's two kinds of objects, two kinds of qualities, there are these four tensions. And as I argue in the Quadruple Object, this is the basis for what space and time are. People have been talking about space and time for eons, and space and time have always been treated as two unique, privileged dimensions of the world that are unlike any others. They're peerless. I tried to claim in this book that time, space, essence, and eidos are the four. You've got time here, space, essence, and eidos. Now that I've talked about this a bit, let me go back and say why this is important. The tension between objects and their qualities is at the center of object-oriented philosophy, and I've tried to claim that all other philosophies have tried to destroy these tensions. All other philosophies have tried to reduce objects to their qualities, or reduce them to their effect on other objects. And for this, I want to go back earlier in history to the ancient Greek pre-Socratic philosophers. I know you had Parmenides in the class, but let me go back even a few philosophers further and go to Thales of Miletus, considered the first philosopher and first physicist of Western civilization. This is in the 600s BC on the west coast of what is now Turkey, though they were Greeks who colonized that area at the time. Thales was the first to come up with a theory about the world in Greece that was not some sort of religious story involving the Greek gods. Thales said the first principle of everything is water. And as naive and quaint as that might sound today, it was a first attempt at a theory that would explain what everything is made of. Thales noticed that living things were moist, that the ground was moist in the morning, that life came from the oceans, so it made sense to say that water was the basic principle of everything. Other pre-Socratic thinkers said air, others said fire, others said it had to be a combination of air, earth, fire, and water, others said it would be atoms, uncuttable small things. Now, that's the only one that's still taken seriously today, by the way. And then a whole group of other pre-Socratic thinkers said all of those things are too specific. It has to be this more indeterminate blob-like lump that everything comes out of. And this was called the aperon. The aperon, we don't translate it in English. We leave it in Greek usually. It means the boundless, sometimes the formless or the limitless. Now, what do all these philosophies have in common? What they all have in common is the idea of reducing everything to some primordial root. And I've referred to this as the undermining of objects. You're undermining mid-sized objects like chairs and bodies and podium by finding some tiny ultimate particle or some ultimate level of which everything is made. Okay, what's wrong with this? What's wrong with this is it does not really account for what we call emergence. If you think about it this way, supposedly all the atoms in your body are recycled every 7 years or so that all these atoms here were not here in 2007. This all came from food or from something else. The atoms are all gone, but in some sense this is the same body as I had in 2007. So you can't over-identify a thing with the individual particles of which it is made. You cannot identify Sciarc with the exact people who are here, because people leave, people come. You were in Santa Monica originally, right? You've extended this building recently. So you cannot identify the institution Sciarc with its physical components, whether they be walls or whether they be people. So in order to account for that, you have to realize that things cannot be undermined. There are things at higher levels. Things are not simply explicable in terms of what they're made of, ultimately. Obviously, if all the atoms disappear from Sciarc, the institution's probably gone, but within certain limits, you can replace those particles. It doesn't matter what a thing is made of. A thing has a certain robustness, even when you change what it's made of. Okay, that's the ancient gesture of getting rid of objects. Ancient philosophers get rid of objects by undermining them, by going beneath them. I've argued that the modern maneuver is different. The modern maneuver is what I call overmining. It's a term I coined myself. It means that instead of dragging things downward to what they're made of, you're dragging things upward to their effects on humans. And this is what you're usually going to see in most theories today. You're going to see people who think that objects are nothing but events, they're nothing but their relations, their effects on other things. Bruno Latour, my favorite living philosopher, says that a thing is nothing more than whatever it transforms, modifies, perturbs, or creates. A thing is its actions. That's an example of overmining. What's wrong with the overmining theories is that they cannot explain change, which might sound counterintuitive at first, but if you think about it, if I were nothing more than my effects right now, my effect on those listening to me in this room, the effect on people reading my books elsewhere in the world, how could I have new effects in the future? If an object or a person, as another example of an object, had no surplus, nothing that was currently unexpressed, no potentiality, as Aristotle called it, it would not be able to do anything different in the future. It would only be always what it is. And so for that reason, objects cannot be overmined either. Object has to be more than its components and less than its effects. Otherwise, it would never be an individual object. And I've also argued that these two maneuvers usually go together. People usually combine them. People use both strategies of destroying objects. And to give a couple of examples here, scientific materialism in its normal form is guilty of this double maneuver, which I thought of calling duo mining, D-U-O mining. And my first idea was to Google that and see if it was already taken. And it actually was, but it was taken by the credit card industry to refer to data mining and text mining people simultaneously. And so it had that sinister connotation that I liked. Dual mining to me means you're both reducing an object to its pieces and reducing it to its effects simultaneously. And you're accepting anything as good except the object itself. So here's an example, scientific materialism. Scientific materialism looks like an undermining strategy because it tries to say all these objects you see aren't real, they're made of subatomic components. That's what really explains what they are. But then when you get down to those subatomic components, what are they? They're mathematically knowable. They're translatable perfectly into equations. You can perfectly know the properties of these subatomic particles, at least in principle. We may have a few more experiments to do, but the idea is that eventually we're going to be able to mathematically model exactly what makes these things real. That's an overmining maneuver, right? Because you're saying the worlds can be translated without information loss into mathematical equations. And this is what some contemporary philosophers say, like Alain Badiou, Quentin Meillassoux in France, had this idea that mathematics is a privileged way of knowing the worlds. Okay, so you've got for me, the object is that which cannot be undermined or overmined. It's that which is in between the two strategies. The object is that which is more than its parts, less than its effects. Another example of somebody who dual minds is Bruno Latour, who is again my favorite living philosopher. Latour says, for example, he's a classic overminer. Latour says an object is nothing more than what it does. There's nothing in an object other than its actions right now. And so if the object does something different in a few minutes, it's actually a slightly different object. Okay, so that's overmining. But then what happens is Latour, about 10 years ago, realizes, my point, that you cannot explain change this way. If a thing is only what it does, how can it ever do something different? Because it's exhausted itself in its actions. How can it perform new actions a few minutes from now? And so Latour comes up with this concept that doesn't last long in his books called the plasma. And the plasma is like what the pre-Socratics called the apiron. It's like this formless blob from which changes emerge. And he goes so far as to say things like, why did the Soviet Union collapse overnight without warning? The plasma did it. This rumbling underground, mutable blob simply causes a change and causes the Soviet Union to collapse, all right? Why do friendships and love affairs suddenly decompose without anyone expecting it? The plasma. And my favorite example that he gives, why does a mediocre academic musician suddenly compose a brilliant symphony? I don't know if that ever happened, but if it happens, it was the plasma. So there's this single underground rumbling force that just causes changes randomly here and there. And I think it's understandable why he gave up that concept, because you can't explain why the plasma collapsed the Soviet Union and not NATO. You can't explain why it collapses this love affair or friendship and not another one. It just isn't a very useful concept. It's just his way of trying to account arbitrarily for changes. All right, so object-oriented philosophy has a lot to do with avoiding both of these forms of mining. Now here's something about overmining and undermining. They're both forms of knowledge. What is knowledge? Great question. My answer is this. There are only two basic kinds of knowledge. If somebody asks you to explain something, you're going to do one of two things. You're going to tell them what it's made of, you're going to tell them what it does. Those are the two kinds of knowledge, really. Think about it. See if you can find a counterexample. I can't find any. Somebody asks you what is walking pneumonia. Somebody I know has walking pneumonia right now. Well, you can explain what causes it, or you can explain its symptoms. You can say it's mycoplasma. Bacteria without cell walls cause it, and its symptoms are very bad coughing, a backache, and so forth. For any question that you ask, what is such and such, the answer is going to be what it's made of or what it does. Those are two forms of knowledge. Now, the interesting thing is, philosophy was never supposed to be a form of knowledge, even though it's misinterpreted that way by many people. If you think about Socrates and think about the word philosophia, apparently the word philosophia seems to have been coined by Pythagoras or one of his students, but Socrates, it's associated with Socrates, because in the Platonic dialogue, Socrates is the one who defends it the most. Philosophia means the love of wisdom, and he's not vague about what that means. Socrates says humans are not gods, humans are not animals, gods can know things directly, animals cannot know anything. That's debatable, but he said animals cannot know anything. Humans alone are somewhere in between the two. Humans alone are in this predicament of being in between. And if you look at the Platonic dialogues, you're going to find that Socrates never actually defines anything. And it's not just because he's sarcastic. Socrates will ask his partners in conversation, what is virtue, what is wisdom, what is love, what is friendship, what is justice? You can never find an example in Plato's dialogues where Socrates says, here's the answer. They're getting closer and closer to the answer. This is the best you can do. Philosophy is not a form of knowledge, and that's why I really regret the attempts to, the past 400 years in modern Western philosophy, to model philosophy along the lines of geometry or physics, which are trying to provide knowledge. Philosophy is something different, and this is why I think I get treated better by architects and designers than by philosophers. Because you guys are not producing knowledge either. You need some knowledge to do what you're doing, but your ultimate goal is not to produce a knowledge, just as for artists, the ultimate goal is not to produce a knowledge. I wrote an essay about this 3 years ago for a Documenta Art Festival in Kassel, Germany. I called it The Third Table. And I don't remember if I suggested this one to be read. I probably didn't, but I should have. What I claim there, I was talking about Sir Arthur Stanley Eddington. And if you have any physics background, you might know who he is. Eddington was a British physicist who was the first one to perform experiments during an eclipse that showed that Einstein's general theory of relativity was correct. Einstein's theory, of course, suggests that the sun should be bending space due to its great mass, which should cause the starlight to seem to bend as it goes past the sun. Of course, normally you can't see this because the sun is so bright that you can't see any stars next to the sun at the same time. So he had the brilliant idea of waiting for an eclipse, and he was able to determine through careful measurements that Einstein was right. This was the moment when Einstein became a household name. He was known to physicists before that, but this moment, I think in 1919, the headlines in the newspapers even said, Newton's theory overthrown, new physics is upon us. That's Eddington, that's his role. There's a movie about him you can find on YouTube. It's pretty interesting. But Eddington also used to be really known among philosophers for his Gifford lectures in Edinburgh. The Gifford lectures are a famous series of lectures on philosophy and religion that important philosophers are invited to perform. William James has done it, Bergson, Bruno Latour has done it, Hannah Arendt has done it. A number of very important philosophers have done this. And Eddington began his lecture by saying, I'm sitting here writing my lectures at the table, but there are actually two tables. First is the table of physics, which is mostly empty space. There are all these particles spiraling around, and it looks solid, but it's not. It's mostly empty space. And that's what I study. I'm a physicist. Then there's the second table that you can't really get rid of. It's the one that you lean on. It's hard, and it has a price, and you can move it around the room. That's the practical table. And he says, these two tables will always be with us. You can't get rid of one and not the other. He says he prefers the first table because he's a physicist, and that's the knowledge he's trying to gain, but you can never get rid of the second table. There's also a famous analytic philosopher named Wilfrid Sellars who says something similar. He says, everything has a manifest image and a scientific image, by which he means the same thing as Eddington. The manifest image is the table as it seems to me in my everyday experience. The scientific image is the one that Eddington was talking about, all the particles swarming around. And Sellars says roughly the same thing, that you can't get rid of the second table, the practical one, but the first table is better. It's somehow a stronger anchor in the world. What I said for this essay was that neither of those is the real table. Why not? Those are just what I've called the undermined and the overmind table. In other words, those tables that Eddington and Sellars are talking about, the scientific table is the pieces that the table is made of, right? It's the physical particles. And the second table that they talk about, the manifest image of the table, are the practical relations that they have to us, our ability to move the table around and put things on them, put jars on them, put silverware on them. Neither of these is the real table. Why not? Because, as I said before, you cannot reduce an object like a table to its particles. It needs them to exist, but it's not simply a sum of particles. And you also cannot reduce the table to what we're doing with it, because there are many different things you could do with it. The table has to be there to be used, right? It's not there because it's used. And so there is a third table. And my claim in this essay was that this is what the arts are dealing with already. They're dealing with the third table. I would say design is doing the same thing, architecture the same thing. Why? Because you're not trying to produce knowledge. When Sellars or Eddington reduce the table to the first or the second, they're trying to produce a kind of knowledge of it. What's it made of? What can it do? What you should really be doing is realizing that the table is not something that can be known in the strict sense. I mean, we may need certain knowledge about things to function practically in the world, but all those kinds of knowledge are grounded in something that's not a knowledge. It's something philosophical or it's something aesthetic. And I've been arguing a lot for the primacy of aesthetics in philosophy over the past decade or so, and I still think this is the right way to go. I think the 400 years of philosophy insecurely imitating the natural sciences and geometry has reached the end of its usefulness. I think it's time for philosophy to learn from aesthetic fields. What do we have in common? We are not forms of knowledge. We are producing or encountering objects that are not reducible to knowledge. Now, this may sound a little far-fetched, but it's not. We are already aware of this in all of our forms of communication, and I can give some examples of this. Metaphor is probably the best example. It's been known for a long time by literary critics that metaphors cannot be paraphrased in prose terms. You simply cannot do it. If you try to say, name any metaphor you can think of from a poem and try to explain what it means, trying to cash it out in prose terms destroys the metaphor. I once wrote about Max Black's essay on metaphor. He's a famous analytic philosopher. He used a horrible example of metaphor. No, I won't use his. I'll use Ortega y Gasset's, great Spanish philosopher. Ortega y Gasset wrote a very important article on poetry in which he talked about a poet who compared a cypress tree to a flame. It's actually more complicated. It was the cypress is like the ghost of a dead flame. But cypress and flame are the primary two terms of the metaphor. Now, what if somebody asks you, how is a cypress like a flame? Any answer you give in prose terms is going to be completely banal. It's not going to quite do justice to it. And this is what happens with bad metaphors or dead metaphors. You can't really quite translate the metaphors into prose terms. Cleant Brooks is one of the literary critics who talked about this. You cannot translate a metaphor into any prose terms. Why not? What is a metaphor doing? A metaphor, according to Ortega's theory, which I accept, takes the qualities of one object, strips them off, and assigns them to another object. So if you use Max Black's relatively boring example, man is a wolf, what's happening is that the wolf characteristics are being translated to the man. And if you try to explain in prose terms what that means, it's going to be very stupid. It's going to be humans are violent and hierarchical and moonstruck or whatever. But the metaphorical effect comes from an object being attached to qualities that are somewhat believable but not entirely believable. You can see enough wolf-like characters in a human that the metaphor seems to work. But if you say humans are like the number 5, it becomes a little harder. So some metaphors aren't close enough to work. You also can't do metaphorical comparisons with objects that are too similar. So if you say a pen is like a pencil, there's not really a metaphorical effect. It's too prosaic because those things do have a fairly literal identity. So metaphors are just one example of where prose factual statements break down and are not of use. And if you consider a prose statement to be a form of knowledge, you're again looking at something that's beyond knowledge, whether it's in architecture and art or philosophy. You're making statements that are not knowledge statements. You're not saying X is Y. You're saying something more obliquely or more indirectly, indirect discourse. Where else can you see this work? You can see this work in jokes. The best way to ruin a joke is to redeploy it in prose terms, to explain the joke in prose terms. You have to do this with children. I think I may have used the other joke here last time, so I'll tell you, I saw a list recently of the most popular jokes in various countries. They had 100 jokes, and they went to every country and asked them to rank them. I don't remember what the best American one was, but it was pretty stupid. The best countries, some country with the best sense of humor, in my opinion, was Belgium on this list. The best one in Belgium, and it's not that great, but it was better than the others. It was, there are 3 kinds of people, those who can count and those who can't. Okay, see, it's not that good, but it's recognizable as a joke. Now, let's say you're with a small child and they say, you know, Daddy, I don't get it. And you have to explain, well, see, the person said there's 3 kinds of people, those who can count and those who can't, but they only said 2 kinds, therefore this is one of the people who can't count. So it kind of reaffirms itself, the joke. All right, you've just ruined the joke, even though you've explained it to a child. You ruin any joke by explaining it. You ruin magic tricks by explaining them. There's an international rule among magicians that you never explain tricks to non-magicians, right? Because they're all fairly uninteresting once you hear the trick. Threats. Probably the best threat ever made in cinema is The Godfather's An Offer You Can't Refuse. If Marlon Brando's character had said, you know, if he doesn't give my friend the part in the movie, I'm going to cut off his horse's head and throw it in his bed at night when he's sleeping, the threat becomes more distinct, but it also becomes less frightening, right, because it's stated. I also may have used the example here 2 years ago of Daniel Dennett's remarks on wine tasting. Daniel Dennett is a very reductive analytic philosopher, teaches at Tufts University in Massachusetts. And he wrote this very funny but also appalling article about wine tasting, where he said, he makes fun of wine tasters. He said, imagine this wine taster saying, a flamboyant and velvety Pinot but lacking in stamina, the kind of thing wine tasters say. And he's saying, that's what a bunch of pretentious garbage, you know, that's not wine tasting. Wine tasting is if you pour wine into a machine and then it spits out a chemical formula at the bottom. That's real wine tasting. Now, obviously, something is lost when that's done. There's something about the wine taster's prose that is needed. And yes, it can slip into pretension. But I would make the case that pretension is simply our occupational hazard. And by our, I mean philosophers, architects, artists. We run the risk of pretension precisely because we have to do things indirectly. You're not going to find a pretentious physicist or a pretentious biologist. You may find a narrow-minded one. But we should embrace that professional risk. Sometimes we're going to slip into pretension because we have to use what sounds like poetic language to address what is really our topic. All right. That wasn't mine, was it? So this is why I think aesthetics is a better model for philosophy in the future than mathematics or the natural sciences. There is a split within speculative realism about this, though. Speculative realism was the name for an event in London in 2007. 4 of us came together because we were all proclaiming realism. Well, what's realism? Realism is the idea that something's outside of us, something's really out there. 2 of the speculative realists, though, think that mathematics and natural science are the ways to get at that reality. Ray Brassier and Quentin Meillassoux. They think that those are the privileged discourses for getting at the reality. Whereas I think it's not possible to get at the reality. I think that realism means a problem for knowledge. Most people who are realists think that realism is about there being a real world outside the mind and we can know it. I say it means there's a real world out there and we cannot know it. Otherwise, it's not a real realism. If you think we can know the world, then you think we can translate that world into our own terms adequately with no loss of information, with no loss at all. And that would be what Bruno Latour calls transport without transformation. I don't think it's possible. I think not just every knowledge is a translation, but every relation is a translation. And now I'm going to go back and say something about Kant that I didn't say first. There are actually two aspects of Kant's philosophy. And there was a very bad article written against me in Art Forum that I think some of you read by Andrew Cole. It was not good at all. People either say one of two things about us. They say, we're just bashing Kant and trashing Kant and not appreciating him. Or they say, we're simply repeating what Kant already said, and so we're not doing anything new. Cole managed to combine both of those claims in one article, and neither of them is true. What's really going on in our relation to Kant, I've already said that Kant is the pivotal philosopher for modern Western philosophy. I think most people would agree with that. But there are actually two things going on in Kant. One of them I've already said. Kant thinks there's a thing in itself that we cannot know. We can think about it, we cannot know it. There are all these limits because humans are finite. Humans think in space and time and the 12 categories. We cannot get at things the way they really are. That's one aspect of Kant. That is the side of Kant that some speculative realists try to reverse. So if you see Meillassoux' book, it's called After Finitude, because he thinks finitude is dead. We need to get back to absolute knowledge, and mathematics is the way to do it. Now that's the opposite of what I'm saying, because there's another part of Kant. The other part of Kant is not the thing about things in themselves. It's Kant's belief that the human-world relation is the center of all other relations. So in other words, Kant would say that you cannot talk about what happens when two billiard balls smack on a table with nobody around. All you can talk about is how that would appear to us in terms of our 12 categories in space and time. Whereas I'm saying that's not true. I'm saying that all relations are on the same footing. That's not completely original because Alfred North Whitehead, great British philosopher of the 20th century, said that that's Kant's mistake as well. Kant's mistake is looking at the human-world relation as the only one that matters. That's the only mysterious one that needs clarification. Why? Because philosophers have tended to take object-object relations and give them to science and say, you guys do with these what you want. You know, physics, you're handling this fine already. Two objects are smacking together. Physicists can measure that. They can test it. That's fine. I'm saying, on the contrary, that philosophy has a right to talk about object-object interactions again, differently from how the sciences do it. Otherwise, philosophers create a ghetto for themselves where we're only talking about the human-world relation, and then neuroscientists come and take that away from us. Thomas Metzinger and Wolf Singer, his comrade-in-arms, two neurophilosophers, say it's time for neurophilosophy to take over traditional philosophical problems having to do with the mind. But don't worry, philosophers, we still need you for ethics panels. So that's what we're going to be reduced to, is just sitting on ethics panels. And I have nothing against ethics panels. I used to sit on them. But that's not all we were meant to do. There's a lot more we can talk about than right and wrong on the human ethical level. So my form of speculative realism is not about reversing the finitude of Kant. I think that's Kant's great insight. The idea that not only can humans not get the world the way it really is, but even inanimate contact, inanimate causation, does not involve direct contact between things. Two objects smack together, they're going to be smacking into caricatures of each other. Two billiard balls, for example, a classic philosophical example. Two billiard balls on a table roll into each other, smack together. I'm holding that they do not touch each other directly because there are a lot of properties that belong to the billiard ball that are not relevant to the collision. For example, the color, the smell, whatever electromagnetic vibrations mosquitoes and dogs can pick up off the billiard balls or any other animal species you can think of. There are lots of properties in the billiard balls that humans can't notice, that other billiard balls can't notice, that animals and insects and cosmic rays cannot interact with because they're not equipped to interact with those. And so an object has almost a bottomless number of properties, most of which are abstracted out of the collision or the interaction between two things. So this is not just something about human and world, it's something about object meeting object. Now, where does this come from? Now I'm going to go back to a bit of the history of philosophy again. I said that the pre-Socratic philosophers were simply trying to reduce things to their physical underpinnings. They were trying to reduce things to the tiniest particles or atoms that explained everything in the world. Okay, when does that start to change? It starts to change with Socrates and Plato. You probably had a little Plato at some point, most of you. Maybe the best way to explain Plato's theory of forms, or theory of ideas, as it's sometimes called, there's the famous myth of the cave, but I'll talk instead about a piece of paper. If you look at a piece of white paper and look at it closely, you're going to find that it's not completely white. There's going to be bluish streaks and spots. You're going to find that the paper is not completely rectangular. And then you're going to notice that you've never seen a perfectly white or perfectly rectangular piece of paper ever. So Plato's question is, how do you know what white is and how do you know what rectangular is if you've never seen cases of them? You've only seen imperfect cases of them. Same with justice. We all seem to have some sense of what justice is, but we've never been in a just society. We've never seen a just society. There's always some injustices in any situation. Friendship. We've never been completely undisappointed by any friend. We've never felt that anyone was sufficiently loyal to us, perhaps. But we have some idea of what friendship is, even though we've never encountered a perfect case of friendship or love or anything like that. And Plato's idea, of course, is that we must have knowledge before birth of these things, that there must be perfect forms that we encountered at some other time. So there's a gap in Plato's philosophy between the perfect things and this world that's explained by the myth of the cave. And again, the problem with the myth of the cave, there's one problem with it. You know, the man goes outside the cave and sees the real things that are casting the shadows, and he comes back and he's killed by the other cave dwellers because they don't like him, telling him that all these things you're watching here are fake. Your entire life has been a sham so far. Behind you is where the real objects are. They kill him. The problem, that's supposed to be Socrates. It's supposed to be Plato's personification of Socrates, as the philosopher who went out and saw the truth and came back. The problem with that interpretation of the myth is that Socrates doesn't really have knowledge. And he reminds us of that over and over and over again in the dialogue, that he's ignorant, and that he's only superior to the rest of us because he knows he's ignorant. We think we know, he knows he doesn't know. Because the philosopher is in the position of being someone who loves wisdom but doesn't have it. Anyway, there's a gap there. Now, there's another gap in Aristotle, Plato's student and also a rebel against Plato. This isn't often noticed. People often see Aristotle as a kind of a boring middle-aged philosopher. He's probably the least popular great philosopher right now because they see him as such a bore. He seems so logical and rational, it doesn't seem like there's any fun to be had in Aristotle's philosophy. But he said something very interesting in the Metaphysics. Aristotle said you can never define anything perfectly. Why not? Because we define things using universals, using language. We call a thing red, or we call a person happy or aggressive or friendly. These are universals. But a person is not made of universals. No thing is made of universals. Things are concrete. You can't take a bunch of words and put them together and get a thing. And so there's a gap there too in Aristotle. Anything we say about a thing is never doing justice to the thing. A thing is undefinable. That side of Aristotle is usually forgotten. Then you get Plotinus, the great Neoplatonic philosopher from Egypt, who worked in Alexandria and Rome, who believes that the world is a series of emanations. There's the one, and then the one emanates the next level, and it emanates and emanates and emanates, and this world is the lowest level. And you're supposed to meditate and think and work your way back up to the higher level. Now I want to say something about Islamic philosophy, which is too often edited out of this story. The first thing is we should read all of the world traditions in philosophy. There's a lot to be learned from all of them, all around the world. But Islamic philosophy is not a non-Western philosophy. So we should start there. Islamic philosophy is a Western philosophy for two reasons. They share the same prophetic tradition as Christian and Jewish culture, and they work from the basis of Greek philosophy. So Islamic philosophy is a Western philosophy, and it exerted a great influence on Western philosophy, partly through preserving Aristotle when the West had forgotten Aristotle, but there's an even more important thing they preserved, and it's this idea of gaps, causal gaps between things. There's a philosophy called occasionalism. It usually is talked about in 17th century France, but we have to go back. It started 800 years earlier in Islamic philosophy. And it started actually with people we would now consider reactionaries. There are two basic groups of Islamic theologians in Iraq, in early Islam. One of them called the Mutazilites. These were the so-called liberals. They liked Greek philosophy. They saw it as very useful for Islam. These are names like Avicenna, Al-Farabi, Averroes, who was in Spain, Al-Kindi. Then you had another group that was a kind of theologically reactionary group, but that had great importance for philosophy. These are the so-called Ash'arites. Al-Ash'ari, being the one that founded this group, his idea was that not only is it blasphemous to say that God is not the only creator, I mean, obviously any monotheism, God is the only creator. He said God is the only causal agent in the universe. So in other words, when I pick up this microphone, it's actually God picking up the microphone for me. God is the universal causal mediator. in everything. So there's a gap. Two things cannot touch. God is coming in between every time. It sounds quaint to us today, but it came into Europe about 800 years later for an interesting reason. Modern philosophy in the West starts with René Descartes in France, who has two basic kinds of finite substances. There are minds and bodies, basically, for Descartes. His big question was, how do minds and bodies interact? Because they're so different. He didn't have a body-body problem, interestingly enough. He thought that he tended to think that the entire physical universe was one big body. And so there wasn't any problem with how physical things can touch and affect each other, which allowed him to keep religion out of physics. It was very convenient for him. God is only needed when there's a gap, and the big gap for him is between mind and body. If I decide to move my arm, how can I do it? It's God doing it. God is acting on my will to move the hands. Of course, this caused theological problems in Islam 800 years earlier, because the question is, if God is moving your hands, let's say I murder somebody, is God moving my hand to stab the person? Then isn't God responsible? And there were intense theological debates about this at the time, but in Descartes, at least, he was interested only in the mind-body problem. And then one of his students, disciples, Nicolas Malebranche, brought back the body-body problem from Islamic philosophy. He said there's also a problem there. How do two bodies interact? This is what's called occasional cause. Fire and cotton touching each other is simply the occasion for God to cause the cotton to burn. Now, it might seem extravagant, but there were important theological reasons why they said this. It had to do with a specific passage in the Quran and how they interpreted it, that not everybody interpreted it that way. And this continued in Western philosophy, so that most of the 17th century philosophers have God playing a very important causal role. Like in Spinoza, God is the universe, so God is doing everything. In Leibniz's case, God programmed every monad, every substance, with its entire future history in it. So I'm not actually seeing any of you right now, you're not seeing me right now. God programmed us to think we're seeing each other at exactly the same time. This is Leibniz's philosophy. And then you've got Berkeley, the great Irish idealist philosopher, who says that God is programming us to see images because images is all that exists. There aren't really things. There isn't a microphone in my hand. God is just making me feel a sense of pressure in my hands. So I think there's a microphone there. Now you might think, where is this going? Because this all sounds like pre-modern, pre-enlightenment religious superstition. How does it provide us any usefulness today? Well, there's a reason. The reason is contemporary philosophy is still thinking this same way. It simply replaced God with the human mind. We are still occasionalists today. This is what our philosophy is made of. Our philosophy, if you go to Hume and Kant, who in some ways, David Hume and Immanuel Kant are the twin pillars even of contemporary philosophy. And what do they both say about cause and effect? They don't say God is coming in and doing everything. They're saying that the human mind is the only place where cause and effect exists. Kant says cause and effect is simply a category of the human mind. We can't know if it's out there. So it's our mind that's producing it on a phenomenal level. David Hume says we can't be sure that the next bread I eat is going to poison me. I just know that every time I've eaten bread in my life so far, it's healthy. So out of habit, I keep eating bread. I don't put it under a microscope and test it to make sure it's healthy. I just habitually assume that I can eat the bread just fine. So causality has been placed in the human mind today, that primarily. Okay, so where does it go from there? Where it goes from there is that Alfred North Whitehead in the 20th century was bold enough to say once again, for the first time in hundreds of years, that God is the source of all causation. Now, why does he say this? Because he says that everything in the world is almost infinitely complex, and simply by perceiving it, we oversimplify it. So I look at Tom's shirt, which looks darkish blue to me from here, but actually, according to Whitehead, it's all the colors of the rainbow, and I'm simply objectifying it in terms of these colors. When God looks at Tom's shirt, he sees every color in the rainbow. I objectify that shirt by going through God using what he calls the eternal object, which is the perfect blue, and I use that to objectify Tom's shirt, which sounds a little bit extreme. And then Bruno Latour, who is Whitehead's great admirer of contemporary philosophers, a person who is even more religious than Whitehead himself. Latour is really a practicing Catholic, but he is less likely to bring in religion to solve individual philosophical problems than Whitehead was. So Latour is what I call a secular occasionalist. Latour says there is a problem here. For example, in France, right before World War II, they had the very rudiments of an atomic bomb project going, led by one Frédéric Joliot, who was the son-in-law of the Curies. He and his wife also both won Nobel Prizes for physics, like his in-laws. And Joliot, at least in France, was the first person to connect politics and neutrons. Neutrons were discovered fairly late by Chadwick in England. Who would have thought there was any connection between neutrons and politics when neutrons were discovered? And Latour's point is that Joliot, at least in France, produced the connection. There's no connection between any two things until somebody produces it and links them. It had to be Joliot, in this case, who linked politics together with neutrons. Okay, it's a very convincing analysis, but then when you think about it, if Joliot links politics and neutrons, what links Joliot with politics and what links Joliot with neutrons? You have to push it back a step further. Okay, Joliot got into politics because of his cousin who was politically connected. I'm making that up. There's some reason he got connected with politics. How does Joliot connect with neutrons? Through scientific research articles and through scientific instruments. Okay, how does Joliot touch the scientific instruments? With his eyeball. How does he touch his eyeball? Through his nervous system. How does he touch his nervous system? There's an infinite regress. You can keep going back as far as you want. And Latour's answer to this paradox is somewhat disappointing. Latour says you stop when it gets boring. You know, the Joliot linking politics and neutrons is interesting. Joliot's eyeball touching a microscope is not so interesting, so forget about it. You just stop the story whenever you want. Okay, that's fine for a sociologist. He doesn't want to write about boring things, but it's not fine if you're doing philosophy. You have to figure out how can any two things touch at all. Well, the reason Latour can't solve this problem is because for him, all objects are of the same kind. Everything is an object if it can affect some other object. That's his definition of an object. He calls it an actor. Actors are what can affect other things. And since everything's an actor, and if you need a mediator between any two actors, you have to add mediators between the mediators and mediators between the mediators. And do you know Zeno's paradox of how it's impossible for me to get out of the room? Because if I try to walk from here to the exit, I have to first go halfway. And then once I'm halfway, I have to go halfway between there and the exit first, and then I have to go another half. I'm going to get closer and closer to the exit and never actually make it. It's the same kind of problem. Now, how can you solve this problem? You can solve it if you have two different kinds of objects, which is what I have, the real and the sensual. Real objects cannot touch real objects, sensual objects cannot touch sensual objects, but the two can touch each other, just like opposite poles of a magnet can touch. And if you have opposite poles of the magnet touching, you can make an infinite chain, but you need those two kinds of objects in order for it to work, and Latour does not allow this. All right, so how are we doing on time? We've gone a little over an hour, so I can maybe wrap this up and go to some questions. Let me just try to summarize a bit. What I've tried to say is that objects should not be undermined or overmined, which means you should not ever think an object is simply reducible to its pieces or to its effects. The first you're probably not going to have to worry about in your field. It's more, well, there is some of this coming into architecture too, I think, right? This idea that everything can be parametricized, or some people want to use Measu for architecture and say architecture is about eternal knowledge. You're more likely to be pressured to see things in terms of their effects, in terms of their environmental contexts, in terms of their, David Rue wrote in a critical article some years ago that architecture is going to turn into ecology because you have to worry about the footprint on this and the footprint on that, and everything links to everything else, and suddenly the entire world is part of your project. You've got Schumacher, who I have a lot of time for Schumacher because he sticks his neck out in that giant manifesto and tells you what he thinks. He's also self-critical to some extent, and I love it when he says, you know, since parametricism is all about gradients and flows and curves, no edges, he says, I have to admit, our one problem is we don't know where to put the doors and windows. It's arbitrary because everything's naturally, gradually curving, and it's, why should the window be here instead of there? He doesn't know where to put the apertures. So he admitted that. At any rate, you should not be turning an object into either of those things, either into its effects or into the pieces of which it's made. You should also not think of architecture any more than of art or philosophy as a form of knowledge. You should not cave into the prestige that is often given to claims of knowledge. There's a place in the world for cognitive enterprises that are not taking the form of knowledge, that are not simply replacing a thing by describing it in perfect prose terms. You should embrace that. You should not worry about that. What else did I want to say? Maybe I'll leave it there and open the floor for questions. Thanks for your patience with a fairly technical lecture. Thank you.
Did you say that the object reaches finitude? And do you mean that in the same way that, say, Foucault talks about finitude in terms of man's knowledge?
Foucault generally writes, he's sometimes called a materialist by some people, and the reason I've never seen that is because it seems to me that he's more of a historicist of the human subject. He doesn't seem as interested in the materials per se or in the objects. And of course, in Foucault, you don't get anything about object-object interactions. You get a lot about how objects shape the human subject throughout history in ways that are very enlightening. But I don't think he would appreciate the object-oriented approach because he would say that, for the same reason, he's a post-Kantian, and he would say we only have access to what humans see and what shapes humans. And I should say something here that sometimes people think they are being realists in philosophy if they just have something that resists humans. So, not to pick on Foucault, but if Foucault were here, he might say, I'm a realist because I think there's real things out there that are shaping us, like disciplinary techniques and prisons and clinics and things of this sort. But what about object-object interactions? This is always my litmus test for whether a philosopher is really a realist or not. Are object-object interactions on the same footing as human-object interactions? And in the post-Kantian period, the answer is almost always no. It's almost always, humans get 50% of reality in post-Kantian philosophies. And that, yeah, at least. That's something we're against.
But did the objects reach finitude?
I'd say objects, right, for Kant, finitude is a human property. It's humans that are finite. I would say all objects are finite because no objects can encounter each other directly. They encounter translations of each other. There's no way for one object to adequately experience another object, whether it's a human or a billiard ball or a piece of cotton or a reptile or anything of that sort. If there were an object-oriented theology, I would say even God wouldn't be able to see things directly, but would have to see translations of things. So it would be kind of a heresy. No one's really pressed us on that point yet, but so convinced are we that no two things ever unlock each other fully. There's always a translation.
Well, I'd first like to say that I really enjoyed your talk.
Thank you.
But I was hoping you could say a bit more about the relationship between philosophy and history. You mentioned that for Heidegger, phenomenology offered no real help in terms of history.
Right.
So do you see your flat ontology as offering some insight into the way we construct history?
Yes, although also trying to limit the sense in which history is brought in, because Manuel de Landa, another philosopher I feel pretty close to, is a realist philosopher, more of a Deleuzian than I am, of course, will say things about history that I don't want to accept. He'll say things like, the only way to differentiate hydrogen atoms from each other is through their different genetic histories. Whereas it seems to me that objects do not preserve all of their histories. That's kind of a fantasy drawn from Bergson's philosophy, the idea that there's this cosmic memory and everything remembers everything that's happened to it. A lot of the things that happen to us leave no trace on us at all, and a lot of them leave a huge impact. So what's the difference? So history plays a role, but it has to be selective. If you simply try to replace a thing by telling a story about how it came to be, you're missing something, quite possibly. And so, yeah, history is there for Heideggerian reasons. History is part of the picture, that nothing ever has full mastery of itself, and often there's a historical background component to what it is. And you can never fully understand the history of a thing. But also history there has to be limits to it so it doesn't take over the whole picture and become a kind of undermining way of getting rid of the object. So you can't simply understand Picasso by looking at his influences. Obviously, there's something more there. Because other people had the same influences, they didn't become Picasso. There's something there that is over and above the chain of influences that led to it. So that'd be my only concern about history. But it needs to be there in a way that it's not there for phenomenology, right?
Thank you for your talk.
Where am I? Oh, okay.
I have a question about truth and facts
Right.
in relationship to knowledge. So if knowledge, in your terms, it is either explained by what something does, the functional argument, or it's explained as what it's made out of, which would be a factual, descriptive, empiricist, Lockean, Humean sort of description. Where do facts sort of, that's how I'm reading object-oriented ontology's position vis-a-vis facts. What about the kind of facts that aren't merely descriptive, like 2 + 2 = 4, or a chemical property, but the fact of, and this picks up on the question of history, the fact of time, that that on, let's say, like on September 11th, these events happen, so and so, and they're kind of situated in time, and there's no sort of descriptive, factual account based on chemical atomistic properties in the Lockean-Humean tradition that can account for that fact. So it has a different epistemological position vis-a-vis truth than the qualitative and the functionalist account.
All right. I've been thinking a lot lately about Latour's new book, The Modes of Existence. And what he's trying to claim there is that there are different modes of truth, and he thinks what's happened, unfortunately, in modernity is that the scientific method of correspondence has swallowed up all the other kinds of truth. And he gives two very good examples of this. One, of course, is religion. That scientific truth has totally swallowed religious truth, in the sense that if you can't prove the objective existence of God and the prophets, it would be thrown out by most scientifically minded people. Whereas Latour tries to claim there's another religious mode of truth. And even if you don't accept that, you'll probably accept it in the case of law. Law is the one where people have left it alone and realized that legal truth is not the same as scientific truth. That if somebody misses a filing deadline and isn't allowed to bring in a certain witness, too bad. And if the judge will simply say these facts are taken as true, rather than saying that they're true. And no one really complains that law is relativist or anything like that, right? There's a recognition that law has its own sort of truth. It links together chains of evidence to try to reach something like a just result. So then I'm wondering, would there be a different kind of philosophical truth? He doesn't really allow for that in his system. Facts, of course, are always in dispute. I wouldn't want to be one of those, like some of the new anthropological philosophers like Descartes, who says there is no objective truth. But I'm not so sure that there are that many cases of facts either. Math is a tough nut to crack, because you want to say 2 + 2 = 4, but what is the truth of 9/11? I think there probably is a reality of what happened in 9/11, but that doesn't mean anyone knows it. Certainly we, the general public, probably do not know it. So I guess facts don't have a special category for them in object-oriented philosophy. A fact would be a claim to have direct access to reality, and object-oriented philosophy is largely about contesting that claim. Here's how I think of it. Some people think you can gain, Meillassoux, for example, thinks that the way to do philosophy is to gain mathematical knowledge of the world the way it really is. That you can know a thing if you know its mathematically formulated primary qualities. So some kind of mathematical model of a thing tells you what it is. There's a problem with that, which is that if you have, let's say you have a perfect mathematical model of a dog that tells us everything we know about dogs accurately, down to the tiniest detail. That perfect mathematical model is not a dog. What's the difference? And these mathematistic philosophers will say that's a stupid point, it's a red herring. None of us think that the mathematical model is really a dog. Okay, but you need to push them on it and say, okay, so what is the difference? What is the difference between the mathematical model of the dog and the dog itself? And what they always end up saying is, this is just a mathematical model, the dog is the mathematical structure inhering in dead matter. But what is dead matter? That's a very ancient concept. It's Aristotle and Thomas Aquinas. So dead matter becomes this alibi they have for not being idealists. We're not idealists. We're not Pythagoreans. We mathematize everything, but the mathematical structure is in matter, but nobody knows what matter is. And this is one of the problems with the model of truth that thinks you can take the form out of the thing and translate it into the mind and know exactly what the thing is without any residue. Normally, there's something in the things that needs something more than that. There's something in the things that needs understanding, that needs, for lack of a better phrase, aesthetic insight. I would say there are something like facts, but they cannot be conceived of as direct access to the forms of things. So there's got to be a new understanding of what makes a fact. And of course, some things that seem to be facts simply turn out to be a matter of group consensus. Having taught in Egypt for 13 years, many of the things that all of my students in Egypt consider facts would not be considered facts in the United States in a classroom. But you wouldn't want to dare say certain things in one of those contexts that you could say in the other. So many of the cases that look like facts are actually not. But I don't want to go into a full-blown relativism either. I just don't want the idea of a direct access to the world as being the model for all knowledge. That's why I mentioned Latour. I think Latour has an insight there, that there are different kinds of truth and different modes of existence.
I wanted to ask you, when you were talking about mathematical models,
Right.
and how do you place statistics? Where do you place it?
Statistics.
Yes.
it seems to do very well in many areas. I don't have any particular philosophy of statistics, just to say that I wouldn't want to replace a thing with statistics about it, for the same reason that I wouldn't want to replace a thing with any mathematical knowledge of it. And quantum theory will be an example, a good example, because there's a statistical interpretation of quantum theory that there's no reality there. There's just a statistical likelihood of the particle being here or there. The way quantum theory usually shows up in philosophical debate, almost automatically it becomes a form of idealism, right? It becomes the mind constructs the world. There's no objective reality. You get that in a sophisticated version in Karen Barad. You get Zizek with a version of that in the parallax view. But I'm not so sure I want to concede that point anymore after talking to some quantum theorists. It's true, according to Heisenberg, that you can't measure both the position and the momentum of the particle with absolute certainty at any given time. To measure one is to not be able to measure the other. But it does not follow from that the mind creates the particle. It simply follows that the observation affects the measurement of one of those two qualities. The particle is there regardless. No one's saying that the particle isn't there until you observe it. And so all it really tells me, Heisenberg's principle, is that position and momentum are relational properties that only exist in relation to an observer. It does not follow that the particle only exists in relation to the observer. And I was talking at Documenta 3 years ago. I did a joint lecture with Anton Zeilinger, the Austrian physicist, the guy that teleports photons across the Danube. He does very fascinating stuff. And he said, actually, maybe you have a point. Maybe you could to put an object in a quantum state may mean to subtract it from its relations. And I like that idea. That was right up Triple O's alley. The idea that quantum theory may actually help justify Triple O rather than counter it, as in the idealist interpretation. So maybe what quantum theory really tells us is that the object is in a state that has neither of those properties. So that spatial-temporal position is not really an inherent property of the thing, but it's a relational property that comes from its contact with us as observers. That might be what it means. And I got on this because of statistics, but I'm not sure if I have anything more to say about statistics.
I guess because there's always a way to get out of the mathematical model limitation in science. And that's why actually I have a problem finding a place for it is undermining and overmining, because it feels like it actually can go from one to another quite quickly, like from the quantum mechanics to actually statistics of big numbers and being the way in which you understand from reality actually instead of being the microscopic view. So it goes between the two. It's more that kind of statistic I was talking about. But
of course, it's interesting that until Galileo, there was a great rift between mathematics and the natural sciences. Right? Natural science was largely qualitative in Aristotle's time and later. Aristotle had very little time for mathematics, and Plato had very little time for the sciences because they were so different. There are some moments, though, when the mathematical understanding breaks down. Some of those come in what Thomas Kuhn called paradigm-shifting moments, where you're not really sure what the object is that you're studying anymore. My interpretation of that, the usual interpretation of that is Kuhn is just this sociological person who thinks society arbitrarily decides what the paradigm is in science. That's how he's often critiqued. I don't think it's that way at all. I think what Kuhn is telling us is that the scientific object, in moments of paradigm shift, becomes paramount as opposed to any of the qualities of the object. The very nature of the object shifts in some vague way that nobody can quite understand. And of course, no one's unified relativity in quantum theory yet 100 years later, and no one really understands quantum theory according to Feynman, even now. So I'm not sure the mathematical approach is always the best. Now, there's this problem that you have in the natural sciences that you don't have as much in mathematics. In mathematics, it's generally the case that when you prove a theorem, it's proven. I don't think there are mistakes in Euclid's geometry. You have non-Euclidean geometry, but that's not a refutation of Euclid. It's just using different axioms to achieve different results. What you have in natural science is you have theories actively being falsified, whereas in mathematics is more of an expansion. And so now Newton's theory of gravity is wrong. He couldn't account for a number of anomalies that Einstein's theory can account for, and Einstein will eventually be overthrown. We might not live to see it. And then there's this so-called structural realism in philosophy of science, which says, yeah, there are those theory changes, but there's a certain mathematical content that remains throughout. But that leads them into absurdities that we don't have to go into here. I've written an article critiquing these people. It's called, I'm also of the opinion that materialism must be destroyed, where I try to refute what they're doing here. I'm not so sure that mathematics is as fail-safe a guide to the sciences as it claims to be. And certainly, I don't think you want to apply these paradigms to something like literature. There are people who try it, right? There are people who say that the Iliad and Jane Austen novels are about natural selection, right? They're simply litericized versions of Darwin. So that, what's Homer about? It's about the strong warriors killing the weaker warriors, and therefore evolution progresses, right? And that'd be an absurd way to interpret Homer, I think, as reflecting contemporary scientific truths. Anyway, I'm not sure if I answered your question, but you got me on a train of thought that interested me.
You got me.
Okay.
Yeah. Hernan, you going? Go ahead.
Well, first, thank you for coming to spend all these days and time with everybody.
Pleased to come back.
I just want to go back to you mentioned this word that always makes me happy, aesthetics. In many ways, that's the key word. One thing is not clear to me in the whole notion of nowadays and all that is the relation of time in relation to aesthetics. Because I'm very sympathetic to your take on the not irrelevant but not so much powerful role of history in some of these arguments. But I would separate time and history as two different things. And I would argue that there is a relation of aesthetics to time in terms of contemporary times or so on, which is slightly different than when the philosophy operates.
Yeah.
I would not argue that philosophy is timeless, because it's not, but in a way it's more flexible in relation to time than, let's say, the more conventional perception of what aesthetics means. So how do you see the relation between time or how aesthetics add up in relation to that as a mechanism to define, let's say, a series of rules, how something that would be appreciated or defined?
There's a couple of different ways to approach that question. First, you could start by classifying which arts are more time-oriented than others. Obviously, film, literature, architecture generally is said to be one where you can't see the whole thing at once, you have to go through. And then you've got something like small-scale visual art that seems less indebted to time. For me, time for me is the bottom tension there between sensual objects and sensual qualities. What is it that makes us feel like time is passing? It's the fact that we see relatively enduring objects, but we're seeing them from different angles and they're shifting around from moment to moment. This is what gives us our sense of time. I don't think time is an independent sense that we have. It comes from seeing things in motion without changing completely. Whereas for me, the aesthetic tension is the diagonal one from upper left to lower right, where you've got a thing that suddenly seems to be hidden there behind its qualities. And one of the reasons I talked about metaphor is because metaphor works only when the comparison is not entirely convincing. Right? You've got a resistance between a thing that's supposed to be taking the properties. I said if I said a pen is like a pencil, that's not really a metaphor. If I say a euro is like $1.14, that's not really a metaphor. That's a literal equation. In order for the metaphor to work, you need to have a kind of difficulty in combining the object with the qualities that are ascribed to it. So when you say the cypress is like a flame, it's hard to put those together exactly. There's something there. There's a kind of vaguely similar shape. And so so for me, the aesthetic tension is that one. And time, well, I approached that question first by classifying different kinds of art according to which ones are dependent on time, but maybe you meant something else. Did you mean a kind of historic time?
Actually, with both.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, there is a creation of the artistic effect, different art and different approaches to it.
Right.
And also time in terms of what we consider in the kind of state of the now and things that will become past or future state of the past. So they all have relation with aesthetics. Even though there are certain principles that they move to time, there are other ones that are really kind of have a very short period of life.
Yeah. Oh, so you're talking about the durability of a work.
No, actually, I'm talking about those. Time as kind of a technique construction of the part. Again, the film, hour and a half, 2 hours, whatever.
Okay.
And the construction of the film is probably 6 months.
Right.
There's all the relation of time, the same with architecture and so on and so forth.
Right.
But also the duration of experience, but also the cultural context that define the relevance of those principles on a particular period of time.
Mm-hmm. Well, I have a thought about the other question, which maybe isn't the one that interested you, but the durability of the work. Okay. Oftentimes, what makes a work of art durable or a work of philosophy durable is its susceptibility to a multitude of interpretations, which means the fact that it's not equivalent to any of its interpretations. Why can you read Hamlet 50 times, but you probably can't read one Batman comic 50 times unless you're a big Batman fan? It's because there's such a possible multitude of interpretations of Hamlet. There's something there. He's created an object in that character that resists your first approach to it, that makes it more and more difficult to paraphrase it, right? If something can be paraphrased right away, like if you can say, this movie is basically this or that, it's probably not a very good film. It's a more complex experience if you cannot do that. That's why it's so funny to read summaries of TV programs and movies, like on the DirecTV listings, where they say this movie is, and they give 2-sentence summary of it. It usually sounds ridiculous. In my book on Lovecraft, I quoted some of Edmund Wilson's summary dismissals of Lovecraft's fiction, which are very funny, but they're also not fair. It's things like, Lovecraft writes about a grotesque race of prehistoric entities who usually erupt somewhere in Massachusetts. And it makes it sound really ridiculous, and it's an accurate description, but when you're paraphrasing it that way, you're reducing it to something that it's not. But I tend to think that works that become classics in any genre are the ones that can resist the various interpretations that are thrown at it at any given time. And they're there as problems or as monuments that you can't quite exhaust at any given moment. As for what I think your question was, I'm not sure how to go much further than the classification of artworks that are very dependent on time and those that are not. My understanding is that most architectural theorists have linked it very closely to time because of the fact that it's a kinetic experience to move through a building. Is that not universal? I think Eisenman said that, and probably some others. That architecture, like film, requires some movements, and so therefore requires a series of images in your mind and a series of kinetic experiences, where you wouldn't say that about a painting. You can sit in front of a painting for a while and look at it, but it's all there at the first go, in a way that architecture or film are not. It requires an experience. There's a hand back here.
Is that?
Hi, I'm curious about the definition of object, I guess. On one hand, as a scalar problem, so how do we understand objects within objects within objects within objects? So for instance, the building, the window, the pane of glass, the particles that constitute the pane of glass, each of those would have some object-to-object relation to one another. And there would seem to be a floor which we would hit, which I guess would relate to what you're calling undermining, which is there's a scalar substrate that we can't understand any further. Mm-hmm. And then there is also the larger and larger, the building relates to the city, relates to the country, relates to the planet, relates to the solar system, et cetera. Those also seem to constitute sets of objects, all nested with each other. And then we'd hit a sort of ceiling of overmining at which we can't conceive, again, of a kind of larger scale than the universe or the dimension or whatever it might be. And how do all of those scales of objects, how do we define those in relation to each other? How do we know an object is an object, or what constitutes an object? And also, how does that relate to the problem of that knowledge only being possible through our conception of it?
Right. You raise an interesting question here. The first thing is, I reject most of the definitions of objects that are given, or at least the tacit definitions that are accepted of objects, like durability. They have to be physical, usually solid, non-human. These are usually the criteria that people assign to objects. For me, an object is anything that is not reducible to its parts, downward or upward to its effects. If something has reality over and above what it's made of and under and beneath what it does, it's an object. Now, of course, you can't always know that. You can't always know if an object is real or a fiction. It's easier in cases like trees and soccer balls, probably, but when you get things like demographic things, like the Reagan Democrats, so-called Reagan Democrat, how do you know if that really exists? There might be certain evidence for it, but it's indirect evidence. Global warming is a great example. How do you know that that exists as an entity? You can't know it by looking through a microscope and identifying it. It's a very complicated set of interactions that have to go on to establish the reality of climate change. And so our knowledge being always fallible, we can't know. I mean, people for a number of years thought there was a planet called Vulcan hiding behind the sun, causing the perturbations that we were seeing. And then it turned out that Einstein explained it better. There is no planet Vulcan. But for a while, that was posited as the mystery planet behind the sun that we couldn't see that was causing everything to happen. So objects enter and disappear, science even. And so we can't ever know for sure if something is an object. We can't know if a certain style is real or not, and art historians or other historians can argue over that. Was there really a Roaring Twenties? Was there really a San Diego indie rock scene? I mean, that's a question for music historians. It might be some trumped up idea that the locals promoted in order to promote themselves. So no, you can't ever really know exactly what an object is. As far as scales don't really matter. There can be objects at all different scales. Humans are also objects, and that sometimes upsets people or disturbs people, but it's not. It doesn't mean people should be treated politically like objects. It doesn't mean people can be shot and disposed of whenever we feel like it. It just means that humans are not reducible to their various organs and not reducible upward to their social effects. And obviously, you need to be able to distinguish between different kinds of objects, but as a first step of clearing the decks of prejudice, you need to say everything's initially on the same level. You cannot assume that you know what humans have that dolphins don't have, or what humans have that rocks don't have. As a first gesture, you have to flatten everything out. Now, I don't have a totally flat ontology because I believe in a difference between real and sensual objects, which Latour, for example, does not make that distinction. He has no real objects. He has no sensual objects. He just has actors, things that do stuff. But the scalar problem doesn't really exist for us. You can have entities embedded in other entities. It doesn't follow that there's one largest entity called the world that incorporates it all. And it doesn't follow that there's any lowest level. Scientists have never been able to find a lowest level, a smallest level of structure. And there's no knowing if they ever will. So I think you just keep an open mind about what different scales objects might exist at. And admittedly, social objects are harder to prove the existence of than other. Was there an Arab Spring, for example? I lived through that. Was there really an Arab Spring, or was it a big fraud, or was it a missed opportunity? You can't really know. This is the kind of thing people argue about. So it's not a correlative knowledge. It's about the love of these things, love of objects, love of knowing whether they're really there or not. That's what philosophy is. There's not ever going to be a final resolution of that.
Hey, Graham. Yeah, I wanted to say again, thank you for being here. This is, I think we're just getting started here, and
Mm-hmm.
I know you didn't plan on talking about architecture today, and that's not the
Right.
goal. But I think that you're an interesting figure for us as architects because you're talking to us today as an expert in a discipline which is not ours.
Mm-hmm.
However, you also of late have gone to great lengths to begin to educate yourself in architecture,
Mm-hmm.
and I think at the same time, the opposite side of that coin is that many architects and artists have gone to great lengths to educate themselves in what you're talking about and your contemporaries. And I wonder, so far, in your readings of architecture, I mean, I could go into all of the ways right now of like how what you've brought on the table has begun to affect the way that architects think, but I'm curious how architecture so far, if there are certain people or concepts or even the materialism that's sort of embedded in architecture, if there are certain things about architecture that have started to like irritate you or interest you or excite you or whatever.
My understanding, I'm pretty new to this, as you mentioned, and it's just largely through this coincidence that David Rue and I were undergraduates together years ago. We weren't really close friends. We played a little saxophone together. And I'd heard through the grapevine that he had gone on to architecture school, and I sent him a letter that he apparently never got to Columbia. And then years later, he pops up and says he thinks my books have some interest for architecture. I met him in New York, and we started talking about it. And one of the first things I did is said, okay, give me a reading list. Give me 10 books I have to read now so that I don't make a fool of myself in discussions. You can all do that with philosophy too, by the way. These things need a lifetime of study, but 10 books in almost any field is enough to get you in the conversation so you know what the basic camps are and what's going on. My understanding of what was going on is that there was a long period when Deleuzian concepts could do no wrong in architecture in some circles. And I can see traces of that in a lot of the contemporary stuff I've read. And Deleuze was a real breath of fresh air for me in graduate school in the 90s. When I first got to graduate school, it was all Derrida and Foucault, pretty much. And Deleuze was seen as this kind of fringe clown figure at this time, kind of like Baudrillard. They were the two mouthy, fun French guys who nobody took that seriously. And then Deleuze's status somehow changed around the mid-90s in philosophy. So I'm happy that he had that impact, but also I could see some of the things I didn't like. And I engaged first with Patrick Schumacher just because he was the first to engage with me. He was the first to mention me. There was that special issue of TARP at Pratt, and they got Schumacher to write for it somehow, and he made some dismissive comment about Triple O at the beginning and said, what I'm really interested in is parametricism, and he starts explaining all of it. And then I met Patrick and found that he was a great guy to argue with because he doesn't take things personally, and he's very clear about his theoretical standpoints, and I think almost all of it is wrong. And he didn't mind my saying so. So that was how I got my first foothold in, and then I started reading Le Corbusier and Eisenman and various things. And I'm excited about, I mentioned this at the beginning, you people are under pressure to innovate in a way that we're not, and this slows us down too much. So we tend to become historians in continental philosophy because things move so slowly. And it's such a genius-oriented model of philosophy that people get demoralized very quickly about the possibility of doing original work. I can't do what Heidegger did, and therefore I can't do anything original. I'll just translate Heidegger or write an article about Heidegger. So whereas you guys can't do that either. I mean, you might be influenced by certain models, but at the end of the day, you have to produce something with a modicum of originality. And so in many ways, simply the atmosphere of architecture is exciting to me, and I feel my IQ rise when I come to a place like this, because people are using their brains in different ways. As for anything I especially like or dislike, no, I'm finding a lot of positive things to take from everything I've been reading. I hear people say positive or negative things about other projects, and I file that away, but I tend to like too much. That's why I wouldn't be a good architecture critic. I tend to see the positives in everything I see first. But,
Maybe just to follow up on that, I remember reading you talking about style,
right.
And I thought it was really interesting the way you framed it.
Mm-hmm.
You said that style is too often considered something that's fleeting, that is something that isn't an inherent quality to a thing or isn't an object, and then you go on to explain how, in fact, style itself is a type of object, and I wonder if you could talk about that for a second.
Right. In some ways, a person creates a style more than they create individual works. And I got in a big argument about this with a sculptor in Chicago 15 or 20 years ago. He was saying there is no such thing as style. Style is just something you abstract from all the individual works they've created. I don't think that's true. I have the sense that you can see a style in someone, you can see it mature, you can see them when they reach their voice, find their voice, and you can imagine them having done other works in that vein. Sometimes you can find drafts for unpublished or unwritten novels or buildings or whatever, symphonies, and you can detect the style in that, even though the thing was never created. And I guess in principle, you could probably train a computer to do things. There already is this, right? There's a computer at the University of Illinois that can turn any melody into a Bach fugue on top of Old Smoky and banal little songs like that, turn into Bach fugues very beautifully. So there is a Bach style. You can recognize whether this sounds like Bach or not, and maybe it's not perfect. There's what's that software online that turns anything into a reggae song just by changing the length of the beats? That works very well, right? It works very well. So I do think style is a real thing over and above the individual works. It's the style that allows you to write the book and not the book that creates the style. I mean, the style can evolve a little bit. Maybe I should talk about essence then, because we were talking.
Great, and even just authorship versus style versus essence.
We were talking the other night when I first got here about essence, and I'm one of the few people today who will defend the concept essence. It's usually seen as this repressive, patriarchal, old-fashioned concept. I don't think so. I'll explain why. All that essence really needs to mean is that a thing is what it is, regardless of what you think it is or regardless of what you try to do to it. So you're not going to be able to eat cement, right? It's not the essence. What cement is not something edible for humans. You're going to die or become very sick if you do it. Whether or not you're actually eating it now, it actually has the capacity to make you sick or dead if you eat it. That should be a fairly uncontroversial concept. Cement doesn't become lethal simply in the moment that someone's stupid enough to eat it. It is actually lethal. You shouldn't eat it. Now, what essence usually means in most people's minds is it means something that's also knowable and something that's eternal. It doesn't have to be either of those. Let's look at the example of Edward Said, the late Edward Said, who wrote this famous book, Orientalism, among others. And he did a lot, I think, positively to stop wildly racist generalizations made by certain scholars. But I think there are also some things he says that are wrong. For example, when he's talking about the Orients, which of course was the old British colonial term for everything Turkey eastwards, right? It was too sloppy a category to begin with. But some of the arguments he makes against it are not very effective. Like, for example, he will say, there is no essence of Egypt, right? Every Egyptian is different, and so on and so on. Well, I say to that, yes and no. The problem with saying that is that you sound like Margaret Thatcher. What did Margaret Thatcher get in trouble for saying? For saying society doesn't exist. There's only a bunch of individuals, and they vote and they shop, and they're consumers. So it's bad when Margaret Thatcher says it, but then when Said says it, it's somehow some liberating gesture. No. I mean, yes, every Egyptian person is different, just like every American person is different, but there are things you can do in Egypt but not in America, and vice versa. I had a student in my class in Cairo. This was hilarious. His night job, his English was perfect. His night job was telemarketing to the USA. His English was perfect, but his cultural knowledge was not perfect. So they had to train him in American culture before he could do this. And he told me what they taught him, and it was hilarious. It was things like you cannot ask a stranger on the phone if they're married, which we take for granted. But if you're in Egypt, the taxi driver will ask you if you're married. It's just a normal part of the culture. The taxi driver will ask you your salary in Egypt, which would be grotesquely rude here, right? So there are things you can do in Egypt and not here, and vice versa. There was Lonely Planet is filled with these things, right? I think here you could blow your nose, but you'd better not spit. And when I went to Peru and picked up the Lonely Planet guide, it said you can spit, but you can't blow your nose. It's considered the most rude thing to do in public, is to blow your nose. And I asked my Egyptian students, and they said, here we can do both. So they're not essential in the sense that they're unchangeable. My favorite example is the Swedes, who were brutal, marauding Vikings at some point and now have the most humane welfare system in the world. So obviously you wouldn't want to say that brutal marauding is an essential Swedish property. That must have been an inessential property. There's some underlying thing there that is capable of both of those things. Aristotle defines a substance as something that can have different qualities at different times. Socrates can be happy, then he can be sad the next day. He's still Socrates. Whereas happy is always happy, sad is always sad. Socrates can be happy or sad. And so often you notice real objects when you notice contradictory properties. Right? That's when you know you're onto something real. If you see a paradox is often a sign of reality. If somebody seems paradoxical, it's usually because they're a very interesting character. They're able to have two different sides at once, or a culture. I often find you know a theorist or an author or a builder is good, not if they're criticized. Sometimes they say, I'm being criticized, I must be doing something right. Not always true. Bad people are criticized too. But if somebody is criticized simultaneously for opposite reasons, that's a very good sign. If somebody says this about you and the opposite about you negatively, they're often both missing the point because there's something substantial there that's not connected with either of those qualities. And so when I defend essence, I'm simply defending the idea that a thing has an inherent characteristic to it that might change, that's deeper than what it's currently doing or what it's currently manifesting. And I don't see any problem with that. I think the problem with essentialism is when it becomes an essentialism of knowledge. So you have somebody saying the Arabs are inherently undemocratic and therefore they need to be ruled by an imperial power, right? Which you heard statements like this in the past. Now that's a bad kind of essentialism because it claims a direct knowledge of the essence of a people or a person or a thing. But that's not the same as saying that a thing has an essence and we don't know it. We don't know what its inherent characteristic is and we never will. Because then you have to handle it more cautiously. You have to approach it more discreetly. But I think getting rid of essence runs on the slippery slope to a very dangerous kind of idealism, where you can make yourself into anything, or you can make anything into anything. You can reshape parts of the world to be something that they're not. These are actually very dangerous things when you don't take account of the inherent features of a place or a person or a discipline. It leads to all kinds of disasters.
Thank you, Graham, for a great lecture.
Thank you.
I was curious to hear a little more about this notion of caricature. It's something that you talked about in a review of Sherry Turkle's book, The Evocative Object.
Right.
And you mentioned it here today, talking about the billiard balls, their collision, the fact that they can only share a caricature. As an architect, I find that really, that word is something that makes me think of all kinds of ways of beginning to mobilize that architecturally, but so I'd like to hear, I think it had to do also with the act of translation. When you were in the Turkle book, you were saying things always undergo distortion, and sometimes that distortion takes on the form of caricature, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, Latour's phrase is there's no transport without transformation, and that's a nice maxim, that if you move something, it's going to change. And there's no way for, the great example in Islamic philosophy was always fire burning cotton. They love that example for whatever reason. They think God has to intervene and make the fire burn the cotton. But even if you keep God out of the picture, you can see that a fire is not going to interact with all the properties of the cotton. It's going to turn the cotton into a caricature, flammable thing. That's all the fire cares about or interacts with. So the fire has no interaction with the softness, the color, the smell. It just has interactions with whatever makes it flammable. And I call it a caricature or a distortion or a translation. I use those words somewhat synonymously to mean you cannot move a thing from one place to another without altering it. And that cuts against the grain of people who think science or mathematics are privileged discourses about reality, because that implies you can simply extract the essential forms from a thing and get them directly, and you know what the thing is directly. I don't think that can be done. I think there's a translation involved in every case. And just like translating a text from one language to another, you're going to get differences. The same with any interaction at all. It's not just a human problem. It's not just that we poor humans are finites and can't see things the way they are. It's that all objects have this feature, that they're not going to be able to make contact with anything else directly. It's impossible. How would a billiard ball make contact with the total reality of the other billiard ball? It can't, right? It cannot be the other billiard ball. So it's only going to oversimplify, abstract features from the other billiard ball. Abstraction is a feature not of the human mind, but of relations in general. And I want to stress this because relations have too good a press these days in intellectual life. Everyone loves relations. Everyone loves performance and action and events and trying to get away from this old-fashioned idea that there's solid things hidden behind the interactions. Well, but I'm not talking about solid things. I'm talking about mysterious things that aren't ever quite present. Even when they're spatio-temporally positioned, they're being distorted in that way. The thing is not something inherently spatial or temporal. Those are relations for me. The thing itself is in some other manner. It's not really spatial or temporal. It's not relational in any way. It's non-relational.
Well, I think that you've given us more than enough to think about over like dinner, amongst other things. How are you feeling about questions? Are you pretty much, whoop?
If the dog has a question.
The dog has a question. I think the dog has a question. I was just talking to the students about your wonderful example of the dog as multiple kinds of, the dog of hearts and the dog of spades.
Oh,
and
right.
The dog of, so that was the dog, by the way, that we were talking about. But thank you for your time today and for engaging all of us here. And we look forward so much to the masterclass, and welcome to SCI-Arc.
Thanks. And can I tell one dog story before we leave?
Yes.
This is the funniest story I've heard in the last 2 years. You'll all laugh. My nephew is a pilot for Turkish Airlines, and he flew some months ago to Hamburg, Germany, and the plane landed. And for some reason, the plane had to wait for an hour and a half or something before it went to the gates. They didn't know why. So finally, they got clearance to go to the gates. They went to the gates. My nephew performed his usual post-flight checklists or whatever they are, and went into the baggage area, and one of his passengers was this woman screaming, "This isn't my dog, this isn't my dog." It was in a cage coming on the circular belt. And he said, "What do you mean it's not your dog?" And she said, "I know it's not my dog." And he looked at his checklist, and it said, "Well, there was only one dog on this flight, and it was a golden retriever, and this is a golden retriever. Are you sure?" And she said, "Yes, I'm sure." And he finally said, "Well, how do you know it's not your dog?" And she said, "Because mine was dead, and this one's alive." And it turned out that what had happened was that the baggage guy had opened it up and seen a dead dog in the cage, and had simply assumed that the pilot had screwed up and forgotten to pressurize the cargo bay, and he didn't want him to get in trouble, and so he drove to a pet store near the Hamburg airport, bought a new golden retriever, and put it in a cage and put the dead one in his office. And it's one of the most amazing stories. The poor guy was fired, but he was really trying to help his fellow Turkish Airlines employees. Anyway, I just thought you'd all enjoy that. It's one of the craziest things I've heard in years. Should be a short film or something. Anyway, okay, thank you all for listening.